Blood splattered across the wooden floor of the Rusty Nail Saloon as Vaughn Zimmerman's fist connected with the jaw of the man who had insulted Katherine Porter's virtue. The year was 1876, and in Beaver, Colorado, a woman's reputation was all she had. Vaughn wouldn't stand for anyone tarnishing hers, especially not some drunken miner with wandering hands and a loose tongue. "You'll apologize to the lady," Vaughn growled, his tall frame looming over the now bleeding man sprawled across the dirty floorboards. The saloon had fallen silent. Katherine stood frozen behind the bar, her chestnut hair falling loose from its pins, green eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and concern. At 26, she'd grown accustomed to handling troublemakers herself, but Vaughn's intervention had come before she could reach for the shotgun beneath the counter. "I think he's learned his lesson," Katherine said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The miner scrambled to his feet and hurried out the swinging doors, muttering curses under his breath. The piano player resumed his tune, and the buzz of conversation gradually returned to the saloon. Vaughn adjusted his hat and winced, touching the side of his head where a bandage was visible beneath his sandy blonde hair. "You all right, Miss Porter?" Katherine nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "I should be asking you that. That bandage looks fresh." "It's nothing," he dismissed, though the way he squinted against the lantern light suggested otherwise. "Just a disagreement with some cattle rustlers yesterday." Katherine poured him a whiskey and slid it across the counter. "On the house. For the rescue, though I had it handled." Vaughn's lips quirked into a half-smile. "I don't doubt it for a second, madam." As the night wore on, the saloon emptied gradually until only a few patrons remained. Katherine wiped down the bar, aware of Vaughn's gaze on her as he nursed his second drink. They had known each other for 3 years, ever since she'd arrived in Beaver to take over her uncle's saloon after his death. Vaughn had been one of her first customers, a quiet cowboy who worked for the Silverhorn Ranch outside of town. They'd developed an easy friendship, though Katherine had always sensed something more simmering beneath the surface. "Last call," Katherine announced, ringing the small bell beside the cash box. The remaining patrons drained their glasses and stumbled out into the night. Vaughn remained, turning his empty glass between his fingers. "You should head home too," Katherine said, untying her apron. "That head needs rest." Vaughn stood, swaying slightly. "I'll walk you home first." Katherine frowned. "I live upstairs, Vaughn. I'll be fine." "There's been trouble lately," he insisted. "Those rustlers I mentioned? They've been making threats against folks in town who might identify them. And they were in here earlier." "I can take care of myself," she said, though a chill ran down her spine. "I know you can," Vaughn said, his blue eyes earnest in the dim light. "But even the toughest folks need someone watching their back sometimes." Katherine sighed and nodded. "At least let me look at that wound before you go." "It's bleeding again." Vaughn touched his temple, his fingers coming away red. "Damn. Thought it had closed up." Katherine led him to the small kitchen behind the bar and motioned for him to sit. She gathered clean cloths, a basin of water, and a bottle of whiskey. Gently, she removed the blood-soaked bandage to reveal a nasty gash along his hairline. "This needs stitches, Vaughn," she chided, cleaning the wound carefully. He hissed through his teeth. "Doc Jenkins was out delivering the Miller baby when it happened. My foreman patched me up best he could." "Hold still," Katherine said, threading a needle. "This will hurt." Vaughn didn't flinch as she stitched the wound closed with practiced hands. Growing up with a father who practiced medicine before the drink took him had given her skills that served her well on the frontier. "Where did you learn to do that?" Vaughn asked as she wrapped a fresh bandage around his head. "Pa was a doctor back in Ohio," she explained. "Before the war. Before the whiskey." Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. Many had fallen to the bottle after the war between the states. "Thank you." Katherine put away her supplies and locked the front door of the saloon. The building creaked and settled around them as the night deepened. "I'll check the back door," Vaughn said, standing carefully. "I've already locked it." Katherine assured him. A crash from the alley behind the saloon made them both freeze. Vaughn drew his revolver in one fluid motion, wincing as the sudden movement pulled at his fresh stitches. "Stay here," he whispered. "Not a chance," Katherine replied, grabbing the shotgun from under the bar. They moved quietly to the back door. Vaughn counted to 3 with his fingers, then Katherine unlocked the door, and he yanked it open, gun raised. A startled cat yowled and darted away from the overturned garbage barrel. Katherine let out a relieved breath, but Vaughn remained tense, scanning the dark alley. "Something's not right," he murmured. Before Katherine could question him, a figure lunged from the shadows. Vaughn fired, but the attacker was already upon him, driving him back into the kitchen. Katherine raised the shotgun but couldn't risk hitting Vaughn in the struggle. The attacker slammed Vaughn against the wall, reopening his wound. Blood trickled down his face as he grappled with the masked man. Katherine swung the butt of the shotgun, catching the attacker in the ribs. He grunted and turned on her, giving Vaughn the opening he needed to land a solid punch to the man's kidney. The attacker stumbled, then fled through the open door into the night. Vaughn started after him, but Katherine grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said urgently. "You're bleeding again." Vaughn reluctantly holstered his gun. "That was one of the rustlers. They know I can identify them." "Then you shouldn't be alone," Katherine said, concern clouding her features. Vaughn touched his bleeding head and gave her a wry smile. "You shouldn't be alone here either." "Neither should you," she replied softly. The decision was made in that moment of shared vulnerability. Katherine helped Vaughn up the narrow stairs to her small apartment above the saloon. The space was neat but sparse: a bed, a dresser, a small table with 2 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. A warm quilt covered the bed, and a few books sat stacked on the bedside table. "You take the bed," Katherine insisted. "I'll keep watch from the chair." Vaughn shook his head. "I'll take the chair. I'm not putting you out of your bed." Their stubborn standoff ended in compromise. Katherine would rest first while Vaughn kept watch, then they would switch. As she settled onto the bed, still fully clothed, she studied his profile in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Why did you really step in tonight?" she asked quietly. "With that miner?" Vaughn was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the window overlooking the main street. "Because you deserve better than to be treated that way," he finally said. "Because I care what happens to you." Katherine felt something warm unfurl in her chest at his words. "Get some rest, Vaughn. I'll wake you in a few hours." The night passed in tense silence. When dawn broke, they were both exhausted but alive. Katherine made coffee on the small stove while Vaughn checked his gun. "I need to get back to the ranch," he said reluctantly. "Tell the foreman what happened." "You can't go alone," Katherine insisted. "Those men will be waiting for you." "I can't ask you to put yourself in danger." Katherine set down the coffee pot with more force than necessary. "You're not asking. I'm telling." "I'm coming with you." Vaughn opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, recognizing the determination in her eyes. "We'll need horses. And you'll need to change into something more practical than that dress." Katherine nodded and disappeared behind a folding screen in the corner of the room. She emerged minutes later wearing men's trousers and a flannel shirt, her hair braided down her back. At Vaughn's raised eyebrows she shrugged. "Running a saloon as a woman requires adaptability," she explained, strapping on a gun belt. They slipped out the back of the saloon as the town was just beginning to stir. At the livery stable, Katherine greeted the sleepy-eyed stable boy and requested 2 horses. The boy didn't question why Miss Porter was dressed as a man, or why she was leaving town with the bloodied cowboy from Silverhorn Ranch. As they rode out of town, the morning sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the landscape in gold and pink. Katherine kept her horse close to Vaughn's, watching the trail behind them for signs of pursuit. "The ranch is about 5 miles southeast," Vaughn explained. "If we cut through Miller's Canyon, we can shave off some time. And be perfect targets for an ambush," Katherine pointed out. Vaughn nodded grimly. We'll take the long way around. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic hoofbeats and the creak of saddle leather the only sounds. Katherine found herself studying Vaughn's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, the capable hands that held the reins. "How long have you worked at Silverhorn?" she asked, breaking the silence. 5 years, he answered. Came west after the war. Needed open skies after what I saw in Virginia. You fought for the Union? Vaughn nodded. 18th Massachusetts Infantry. You. My brother fought. Didn't come back. The words still stung, even after all these years. I'm sorry, Vaughn said, and she knew he meant it. Is that why you came west too? After your brother? He asked after a moment. Katherine shook her head. I came because there was nothing left for me in Ohio. Pa drank himself to death, Ma followed from grief. The saloon was all Uncle James left me when the consumption took him. You've seen your share of hardship, Vaughn observed. Katherine smiled faintly. Haven't we all out here? A gunshot cracked the morning air, and Vaughn's horse reared. Katherine watched in horror as he tumbled from the saddle, hitting the ground hard. She dismounted in one fluid motion, drawing her pistol and firing in the direction of the shot. Her horse bolted, but she managed to grab the reins of Vaughn's mount before it could follow. Vaughn! She hissed, dragging him behind a boulder as more shots peppered the ground around them. He groaned, clutching his side. Just grazed me, he managed through gritted teeth. 3 of them, in the trees to the north. Katherine peered around the boulder, spotting movement among the pines. She fired twice, forcing their attackers to take cover. We need to move, she whispered. Can you ride? Vaughn nodded grimly. Help me up. Katherine slung his arm over her shoulder and helped him to his feet. Blood soaked his shirt where the bullet had grazed his ribs, and his bandaged head wound was bleeding again from the fall. Both on my horse, she decided. You're in no condition to ride alone. With a strength that belied her slender frame, Katherine helped Vaughn mount before swinging up behind him. She kicked the horse into a gallop, heading not for the ranch, but for a small line shack she knew was nearby. The shots followed them for a moment, then faded as they outpaced their pursuers. The line shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a lean-to for horses, but it would provide shelter and a defensible position. Katherine helped Vaughn inside and barricaded the door behind them. Take off your shirt, she commanded, searching the cabin for supplies. She found a canteen of water, some jerky, and a first aid kit, standard provisions for cowboys working the range. Vaughn struggled out of his bloodied shirt, revealing a lean, muscled torso marked with old scars. The fresh wound along his ribs oozed blood, but as he'd said, it was only a graze. Katherine cleaned and bandaged it efficiently, trying to ignore the heat of his skin beneath her fingers. You're good at this, Vaughn observed, watching her work. Had practice, she replied shortly. Hold still while I check your head. The stitches she'd placed the night before had held, but the wound was red and angry. She cleaned it again and replaced the bandage. We should rest, she decided. They'll be searching for us, but they won't find this place right away. It's well hidden. You know this area well, Vaughn noted, accepting the jerky she offered him. Katherine settled beside him on the narrow cot, her shoulder brushing his. I used to ride out here when the saloon got too stifling. Needed to remember there's more to life than serving drinks and breaking up fights. Vaughn studied her face. What would you do if you weren't running the saloon? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years. I'd have a small ranch, she said after a moment. Nothing fancy. Just enough land for some horses, maybe a few cattle. A garden. A place that's mine, where I make the rules. Sounds nice, Vaughn said softly. What about you? Always going to be a ranch hand? Vaughn looked down at his calloused hands. The foreman's retiring next year. Boss offered me the position. It comes with the old Patterson Place small cabin, 30 acres. Been fixing it up in my spare time. That's wonderful, Vaughn, Katherine said sincerely. He met her eyes. It's lonely, though. A place like that needs more than just one person to make it a home. The air between them seemed to thicken. Katherine was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from his body. Before she could respond, a noise outside the cabin froze them both. Vaughn put a finger to his lips and reached for his gun. Katherine drew hers as well, moving to the small window beside the door. She peered out cautiously. 3 riders? She whispered. Coming this way. Vaughn joined her at the window, his body pressing against her back as he looked over her shoulder. That's my foreman, Henry, and 2 of our hands, he said, relief evident in his voice. Katherine relaxed slightly but kept her gun ready as Vaughn unbarricaded the door. The 3 riders dismounted and approached cautiously. Zimmerman? Called the oldest of the 3, a grizzled man with a gray-streaked beard. That you? It's me, Henry, Vaughn confirmed, stepping outside with Katherine close behind him. Henry's eyes widened at the sight of Vaughn's bandaged head and bloodied side. Christ, boy, what happened to you? And who's this? His gaze shifted to Katherine, taking in her unconventional attire. Katherine Porter, she introduced herself. I own the Rusty Nail in town. Recognition dawned in Henry's eyes. The saloon keeper. Heard you're a fair hand with that shotgun of yours. He turned back to Vaughn. We've been looking for you since you didn't come back last night. Found your horse wandering near Miller's Creek this morning, blood on the saddle. Figured you'd been bushwhacked. It was Dawson's gang, Vaughn explained. They tried to kill me in town last night, then ambushed us on the trail this morning. Henry's expression darkened. Those rustlers have gone too far. Sheriff Briggs rounded up a posse after they hit the Anderson place last night. 3 men dead, Katherine gasped. The Andersons were good people who had always paid their tabs and never caused trouble in her saloon. We need to get back to the ranch, Vaughn decided. It's not safe out here, and Katherine needs protection too. They saw her with me. Henry nodded. You 2 can ride double on my horse. Tom and Bill will cover our backs. The ride to Silverhorn Ranch was tense but uneventful. As they crested the final hill, Katherine caught her breath at the sight spread before her. A sprawling ranch house stood proudly amidst a cluster of outbuildings. Vast pastures stretched in all directions, dotted with cattle. A creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. It's beautiful, she murmured. Boss built it from nothing, Henry said proudly. 20 years ago, this was just open range. Now it's one of the finest spreads in Colorado. They rode into the yard, where a distinguished man in his 50s emerged from the main house. His silver hair contrasted with his tanned face, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. Zimmerman, he greeted, his sharp eyes taking in Vaughn's injuries and Katherine's presence. Trouble? Yes, sir, Mr. Silverhorn, Vaughn replied. Dawson's gang. They've made it personal. Marcus Silverhorn helped Katherine dismount with old-world courtesy. Miss Porter, I presume? Your reputation precedes you. Please come inside. My wife will see to your comfort while we sort this out. The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly refined for a frontier home. Eastern furniture mingled with Western practicality, and original paintings hung on the walls. Mrs. Silverhorn, an elegant woman with kind eyes, welcomed Katherine warmly and showed her to a guest room where she could freshen up. Your husband seems to know me, Katherine remarked as Mrs. Silverhorn provided her with a clean dress that was only slightly too large. Marcus makes it his business to know everyone in the county. Mrs. Silverhorn explained with a smile. He speaks highly of how you've turned that saloon around. Says you run the cleanest establishment between Denver and Salt Lake City. Katherine flushed with pleasure at the compliment. Thank you. I try to keep the rougher elements in check. And you've caught our Vaughn's eye, Mrs. Silverhorn added with a knowing look. That boy hasn't stopped talking about the lady at the Rusty Nail for 3 years. Katherine felt her cheeks grow warm. We're just friends. Mrs. Silverhorn's smile suggested she didn't believe that for a moment. Friends who risk their lives for each other. The best marriages start that way, my dear. Katherine didn't know how to respond to that, so she changed the subject. How long have you been in Colorado? 23 years, Mrs. Silverhorn answered, helping Katherine with the buttons of the borrowed dress. We came out after the Mexican War with nothing but dreams and determination. It hasn't always been easy, but it's been a good life. When Katherine rejoined the men in the study, they were deep in discussion over a map spread across a large oak desk. Vaughn had changed into a clean shirt, and a fresh bandage encircled his head. He looked up when she entered, his eyes widening slightly at her transformation. Miss Porter, Mr. Silverhorn acknowledged. We were just discussing how to deal with Dawson's gang. They've been raiding ranches all across the county, but this personal vendetta against Vaughn suggests he knows something that threatens them. Vaughn nodded grimly. I recognized one of them during a raid last month. Nathan Dawson's youngest brother, who was supposed to be serving time in Wyoming for murder. If word gets out he's escaped and running with the gang again, they'll have every lawman in 3 territories after them. And now they want to silence you before you can identify him. Katherine realized. And anyone associated with you, Mr. Silverhorn added, giving Katherine a meaningful look. Which is why you'll both stay here until this is resolved. Katherine began to protest, but Mrs. Silverhorn placed a gentle hand on her arm. My dear, your saloon will manage without you for a few days. Your life, however, is irreplaceable. The decision made, Katherine found herself settling into life at Silverhorn Ranch. She was given a comfortable room in the main house, not far from where Vaughn was recuperating. During the day, she helped Mrs. Silverhorn with household tasks, finding unexpected pleasure in activities far removed from her life at the saloon. In the evenings, they gathered in the parlor, where Mr. Silverhorn entertained them with stories of the early days on the frontier. 3 days passed without word from town or sign of Dawson's gang. Vaughn's injuries began to heal, and he started helping with light chores around the ranch. Katherine often found herself working alongside him, and their conversations flowed easily, ranging from books they had read to dreams they harbored. On the 4th evening, as they walked together along the creek, Vaughn stopped beneath a massive cottonwood tree and turned to face her. Katherine, he said softly, using her first name for the first time. These past few days have been the happiest I can remember, despite everything. Katherine's heart quickened. For me too, she admitted. I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting a place of your own. He took a deep breath. The Patterson place I mentioned, it's not much yet, but it could be. It could be everything you described. A garden. Horses. A place where you make the rules. Katherine stared at him, hardly daring to hope he was suggesting what she thought he was. I'm not good with words, Vaughn continued, taking her hands in his. But I'm asking if you might consider a different future than the one you've planned. A future with me. Vaughn, Katherine whispered, emotion making her voice unsteady. Are you proposing to me? He smiled, his blue eyes warm with affection. I reckon I am, though I'm making a mess of it. Katherine Porter, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Before she could answer, the thunder of approaching horses shattered the moment. Vaughn pulled Katherine behind the massive trunk of the cottonwood just as riders crested the hill above them. Dawson, Vaughn hissed, recognizing the lead rider. They've found us. They watched in horror as at least 10 men rode toward the ranch house, guns drawn. Shouts and the first crack of gunfire carried across the evening air. We have to help them, Katherine said urgently. Vaughn's face was grim with determination. Stay here. I'll circle around to the bunkhouse and warn the hands. No, Katherine refused. We go together. I'm not losing you now. The look he gave her was filled with pride and something deeper. Together, then. They moved stealthily through the gathering dusk, using the creek bed for cover. As they approached the ranch, they They could see the Silverhorns and several ranch hands barricaded inside the main house, exchanging fire with Dawson's men, who had taken positions behind the barn and corral. "The bunkhouse," Vaughn whispered, pointing to the long, low building where most of the hands lived. "If we can reach it, we can arm ourselves and flank them." They made their dash during a lull in the shooting, racing across the open ground between the creek and the bunkhouse. A shout went up as one of Dawson's men spotted them, but they reached the safety of the building before any shots found their mark. Inside, they found 3 young cowboys loading rifles. The oldest couldn't have been more than 22. "Mr. Zimmerman!" one exclaimed. "Boss said you and the lady were out by the creek when they attacked." "How many men do we have?" Vaughn asked, grabbing a Winchester rifle from the gun rack. "5 of us here, plus the boss and Henry in the main house," the young cowboy reported. "Dawson's got at least 10 men, but they're spread out." Katherine accepted a revolver and checked the chambers. "We need a plan. They've got us outnumbered." Vaughn thought for a moment. "They don't know how many of us are in here. If we create enough noise from different positions, we might make them think they're surrounded." The young cowboys nodded eagerly, ready to follow Vaughn's lead. Katherine was impressed by how naturally he took command, his quiet authority never needing to raise his voice. "Jim, you and Luke take the back of the bunkhouse. Pete, the loft window. Katherine and I will move to the smithy." On my signal 3 shots in quick succession we opened fire. Aim high at first, just to create confusion. Then pick your targets carefully. These men are killers, but they're cowards at heart. If they think they're outgunned, they'll run. The plan set, they moved to their positions as darkness fell completely. From the smithy, Katherine and Vaughn had a clear view of where most of Dawson's men had taken cover. "Katherine," Vaughn said quietly as they waited for the right moment. "About what I asked you before we were interrupted." "Now is hardly the time, Vaughn," she whispered, though her heart warmed at his persistence. "Might not get another chance," he pointed out. "And a man likes to know where he stands before he rides into a gunfight." Despite the tension of the moment, Katherine felt a smile tug at her lips. "The answer is yes," she said softly. "Yes, I'll marry you." Vaughn's answering smile was brilliant in the darkness. He leaned forward and kissed her a brief, tender promise of more to come. Then he raised his rifle and fired 3 quick shots into the air. The night erupted into chaos. Gunfire came from all directions as the ranch hands executed Vaughn's plan perfectly. Dawson's men, believing they were caught in a crossfire, began to retreat in disarray. Nathan Dawson himself, recognizable by his distinctive black hat, bellowed orders from behind the corral, trying to rally his men. Vaughn took careful aim and fired, striking the post just beside Dawson's head. The outlaw leader ducked, then made a run for the horses. "They're breaking!" Katherine exclaimed as the raiders mounted up and began to flee. A cheer went up from the ranch house as the last of Dawson's men galloped away. Vaughn and Katherine emerged cautiously from the smithy, weapons still ready. Mr. Silverhorn strode out onto the porch, rifle in hand. "Is everyone all right?" he called. A quick accounting found 2 ranch hands with minor injuries and one of Dawson's men dead near the barn. The rest had escaped, but in their haste they'd left behind saddlebags containing stolen items from other ranches, evidence that would help the law track them down. "Sheriff Briggs and his posse should be here by morning," Mr. Silverhorn said as they gathered in the kitchen, where Mrs. Silverhorn was treating the wounded. "I sent a rider to town when we first spotted them approaching." Katherine sat beside Vaughn at the long table, her hand finding his beneath the tablecloth. He squeezed her fingers, a private acknowledgement of what had passed between them. "Mr. Silverhorn," Vaughn said, his voice steady, "I've asked Miss Porter to marry me, and she's done me the honor of accepting." "Mrs. Silverhorn clasped her hands in delight, while Mr. Silverhorn's weathered face broke into a rare smile. "Well, it's about time," he said gruffly. "I was beginning to think you'd never work up the courage, Zimmerman." The kitchen erupted in congratulations and good-natured teasing. Someone produced a bottle of fine whiskey, and toasts were made to the happy couple. In the midst of the celebration, Katherine found herself studying Vaughn's face, the quiet strength there, the kindness in his eyes, the way he looked at her as though she were the most precious thing he'd ever seen. Morning brought Sheriff Briggs and his posse of 6 men. They took statements from everyone about the attack and promised to track down Dawson's gang. With the evidence you recovered and your identifications, we'll have them behind bars within the week, the sheriff assured them. Or in pine boxes, if they're foolish enough to resist. True to his word, 5 days later news reached Silverhorn Ranch that Dawson and his remaining men had been cornered in a canyon near the Wyoming border. After a fierce gun battle, 3 were dead, including Nathan Dawson himself. The rest were in custody, facing hanging for murder and cattle rustling. With the threat eliminated, Katherine returned to Beaver to set her affairs in order. The Rusty Nail had survived her absence, managed ably by her assistant, a no-nonsense widow named Mrs. Hollister. Katherine offered her the position permanently. "You're selling the saloon?" Mrs. Hollister asked, surprised. "I'm getting married," Katherine explained. "And starting a new chapter." The news spread quickly through town. Many expressed genuine happiness for her, while a few of her regular patrons mourned the loss of the prettiest barkeep in Colorado. Katherine found she didn't mind the attention for once. The gossip about her was cause for celebration rather than judgment. 2 weeks later, on a perfect June morning in 1876, Katherine Porter became Catherine Zimmerman in a simple ceremony at the Silverhorn Ranch. She wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Silverhorn had ordered from Denver, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Vaughn, his head finally healed, stood tall and proud in a new black suit, his eyes never leaving Katherine's face as they spoke their vows. After the celebration, they rode together to the Patterson place, their new home. Katherine gasped when she saw it. The small cabin had been transformed. Fresh paint, new curtains at the windows, and a garden already planted with vegetables and flowers. A corral held 2 fine horses, and a milk cow grazed peacefully nearby. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zimmerman," Vaughn said, helping her down from her horse. "It's perfect," Katherine whispered, tears of joy springing to her eyes. "Absolutely perfect." "There's one more surprise," Vaughn said, leading her around to the back of the cabin. There, in neat rows, stood a dozen beehives, buzzing with activity in the afternoon sun. "You mentioned once that your grandmother kept bees," Vaughn explained. "Thought you might want to try your hand at it." Katherine threw her arms around his neck, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I love you, Vaughn Zimmerman," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I love you, Katherine Zimmerman," he replied, drawing her close. "More than I ever thought possible." As the sun set on their first day as husband and wife, they sat together on the porch of their cabin, watching the colors paint the sky above their land, their home. Katherine's head rested on Vaughn's shoulder, his arms secure around her waist. "Who would have thought," she mused, "that a barroom brawl and a bandaged head would lead to this?" Vaughn chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her cheek. "I knew from the first day I walked into your saloon that you were special. Just took me 3 years to work up the courage to do something about it." "Worth the wait," Katherine said, tilting her face up for his kiss. In the years that followed, Silverhorn Ranch prospered under Vaughn's management. When old Mr. Silverhorn finally retired, Katherine's beekeeping venture grew into a successful business, her honey sought after throughout the county. They built a larger home on their property and filled it with laughter, books, and eventually, children, twin boys born in the winter of 1878, and a daughter who arrived 2 years later. Sometimes, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Katherine would find Vaughn on the porch, gazing at the stars. She would join him there, and they would talk about how far they had come from that night in the Rusty Nail when a cowboy with a bandaged head had defended her honor. "You shouldn't be alone here," he would sometimes tease, echoing words spoken long ago. And she would always reply, with love in her voice, "Neither should you."